Dungeon bosses have been around ever since the release of the very first Zelda game back in 1986. Throughout the years, these would go from simply being more powerful enemies to exciting battles where you had to utilize the arena to your advantage. Of course, just because a game like Ocarina of Time or Skyward Sword is newer, it doesn't mean that all of its bosses are enjoyable. You will get those few that can feel recycled or are just uninspired. Unfortunately, when you focus on the bosses of Link's Awakening for the Game Boy, you'll realize that most of them are forgettable. There were some memorable ones, but they were mostly memorable for all the wrong reasons. But after playing the remake on the Nintendo Switch, I can say that Grezzo did an excellent job in modernizing these bosses. They stayed true to the source material, while at the same time made changes to the few nightmares that really needed it. But since the main goal was to modernize this game on a newer system, it means that most of these bosses are still lacking. This made ranking them really hard, as most of them suffer from similar problems. Today, we will be looking at the worst to best bosses of the Link's Awakening remake. More specifically, the nightmares found in all of the story-driven dungeons. So no mini-bosses or color dungeon will be included. This does include the final boss, so spoilers will be in the video. Continue at your own risk. Hothead is a very trashy boss. First of all, its design. It's a giant lava bubble. It reminds me of one of the paintings of Super Mario 64. Plus, the name is really lame. Hothead? More like hot garbage. Okay. Jokes aside, what's the problem here? Well, like most dungeon bosses from Zelda games, you need to use the item acquired from that dungeon to take down its respective boss. Which is all well and good, until you realize that to beat Hothead, an enemy composed of lava and fire, you have to use the Fire Rod. You're using fire to beat fire. Quite literally. And it makes 0 sense. The fight in general isn't anything to write home about either. Hothead will jump out of the lava momentarily and fire lava in multiple directions. This attack repeats until the player manages to hit him with a fire rod. After this, he will fly around the room similar to the star enemy while you take multiple shots at him. Since the path isn't based on RNG, it's really easy to dodge. Once the boss loses a certain amount of health, the battle will enter its second phase. And it changes absolutely nothing. At this point, you just have to hit it until it dies. It's kind of funny since the only reason we can damage him is because he leaves the lava. So he could have just, you know, not jumped out to make him vulnerable. It's no stretch to say that Hothead is worthy of the worst boss in Link's Awakening award. And it doesn't really help when this is the fight that follows the last dungeon in the game. I actually like the name and style of the boss. Something about it being a face on the ground is kind of ingenious? Probably because the remake did such a good job at making it look creepy. The problem is that everything else about this boss kinda sucks. The first phase consists of him hurling tiles and pots your way, but the shield kind of makes this attack underwhelming. Even more so once you realize you can just stand in the corner and it becomes a waiting game. Once all of the tiles and pots have been used up, it will begin to spawn on random parts of the floor and create holes in an attempt to have the player fall. And that's basically it. There's no other attack, and since the holes follow the player, you're essentially untouchable so long as you keep moving. Facade cuts himself off before telling the player his weakness, but it's not hard to put 2 and 2 together, and it won't be long before you are bombing his face, while he just kind of sits there. The holes do serve another purpose though, as you have to be careful where you place your bombs. If they fall in, you have to either try again or wait for him to restart the attack. But it didn't take long for me to realize that any floor tiles under his face are immune to this attack. So all you really have to do is place a bomb on his face and then just wait for it to damage him. Plus, you know that first face we talked about? Yeah, since Facade is there, you can technically damage him. It's more challenging to do so since tiles can push the bombs out of the way, but it is possible. In fact, if you're really lucky, you could probably kill him before his second phase even happens. Overall, this boss felt like wasted potential. I'll admit, Slime Eye used to be at the very bottom of this list, mostly because of how short this fight was. The boss starts by hiding itself until you use the Pegasus boots to hit the wall. The player must hit the eyes a number of times before splitting the boss down the middle. The second phase kicks in, where you have to avoid the 2 slimes that are trying to crush you. You can still get stunned when they fall to the ground, so to prevent this you can use the Rock's Feather and time the jumps just right. The battle ends once you've disposed of both slimes. The problem is that each one can be defeated in only a few hits. hits. One of them can be easily killed before it has a second chance at jumping, and if fighting 2 slimes was already easy, it makes the rest of the battle a snorefest. Aside from that, there are 2 big problems with this boss. 1, in its first phase, it doesn't even attack you. 2, once you dispose of 1 slime, nothing different happens. They should have added some extra attacks to the second slime so it would provide more of a challenge in defeating it. The only reason this wasn't at the very bottom of the list is because the idea of using the Pegasus boots to split the boss in half was a unique concept. Perhaps they could have designed it where the player was required to do this once more and divide them into 4 slimes instead of 2. Unfortunately, the sky isn't the limit, as this was intended to be a recreation of a 26-year-old boss. Before you ask, yes, a recycled boss is at number 6. This just shows how not good many of the nightmares are. And while you could argue that this is the 5th time being used in a Zelda game, Link's Awakening was technically the 2nd time it appeared, the first being A Link to the Past. And it's only the 5th appearance if you count Link's Awakening Switch as its own separate game. But that's not the case, as the game is a remake. If they were to stay true to the source material, they had to include this boss. You could say that it should be lower because it's too easy, but I do have a few counter arguments for that. 1. This is the boss from the very first dungeon. It's supposed to be an introduction of sorts for new players and shows them what they should expect from the game in terms of structure. And unlike the other bosses, at least you have to be somewhat cautious when fighting it. Moldorm doesn't take many hits, but if you fall down at any time, the fight will restart. The Switch version did nerf the battle a bit, as some of the chasm is replaced with cracked floor. The boss's movement is also random, which makes hitting the tail more challenging. You can't sit there and wail on it either, since after the player damages the boss, the tail will be temporarily protected. Even if you do kill the boss with 2 spin attacks, you'll have to do some dodging. You can only ask for so much though, when the player is expected to beat this with only 3 hearts. You know what? I like Genie. I think the design of this nightmare is pretty great, and you have to do a bit of dodging before you can even attack him. His first phase consists of throwing fireballs at the player and then hiding in his jar. All the player has to do is knock it over and throw it against the wall. Repeat this 3 times until it breaks. Genie will start to launch big fireballs, all while charging at the player. It does require some concentration since you have to maneuver around the projectile to attack the boss. And it's only the 2nd dungeon, so this fight isn't too difficult or too easy. I feel that the hint he gives the player on how to beat him wasn't really necessary, as it's already clear what has to be done. I don't really have much to say about this one. It's ranked in the middle because it's still just a below average Zelda boss. It's finally time. You've conquered all 8 of the main dungeons and are moments before battling the final boss. Well, I hope you've been keeping up with the training sequence because it's kind of mandatory to the game. So after realizing this and backtracking for a good hour to find that one NPC you still haven't traded with yet, you make it to the end of the egg maze and confront the final boss. This battle is a pretty long one, with a total of 6 shadow forms: Azul, Egahim, Moldorm, Ganon, Linmola, and Dethl, which is the name of his final and true form. What you'll realize off the bat is that this is the most fleshed out boss in the whole game. And yeah, it should be since it's the final boss. The problem is that so much work was put into this fight that all the other ones feel underdeveloped. And if we solely focused on that, this fight would technically be the best of all 9. And they did a stunning job at modernizing this battle, despite a couple of hiccups here and there. You can see all of the love and care that went into this fight, along with the many others. I would say that the original did a slightly better job at making the atmosphere creepy, but I feel like the limitations of that system helped with creating that feeling. Oh, and they actually gave the final form its own theme instead of just reusing the mini-boss music. Though honestly, I felt that music worked well with the fight for the Game Boy game. But there is a glaring flaw with this fight, and it's why it moved down from the number 1 spot. I went into the Link's Awakening remake with knowledge of the original game, and since I played it prior to the release of the Switch version, I knew how to play the game, including how to fight the bosses. However, I remember getting frustrated when battling the final boss because there were moments I didn't know what to do. This is easier to explain through demonstration. His first phase is the Zol, but you can't just hit it with your sword. You can't use the bow and arrows, Pegasus boots, or even a spin attack. The only way you can damage this boss is by, wait for it, using magic powder on it. Because reasons? His next form isn't so bad. It's the classic tennis match, except the boss doesn't bother hitting it back. Some observation skills are required though, as some projectiles fired can't be deflected back at him. It adds a pretty good challenge. The Moldorm form is, well, Moldorm, but Ganon can't be damaged by most attacks, and the only things that can hurt him are the Pegasus boots and spin attack. Again, this doesn't really make any sense. Why can't I use my normal sword attack on him? The rest of the fight isn't too bad. Lunmola can't be hurt with a normal sword swing, but is weak to a lot more items such as the bow and arrow and Pegasus boots. And it doesn't take too long to figure out how to damage his final form. But overall, there were parts of this fight that were unnecessarily cryptic. It's okay when specific items are required to beat a boss, as long as they make sense. Examples being when you have to throw Genie's jar, and another boss we'll talk about later on. And this is why the final battle of Link's Awakening is number 4. Say what you want about how annoying Eagle's Tower might be, but it does have a creative concept as a dungeon, and the boss itself isn't that bad. They did nerf it, as the fight won't reset if Link falls off the tower. Some people might dislike that change, but I kind of prefer it this way. Similar to the previous two, they did a phenomenal job on the boss design. Evil Eagle's moves consist of flying across the screen, creating blasts of air that launches feathers at the player and will dive to the ground using his talons to attack. That last move was changed slightly, as the Game Boy version only had him dive down to the bottom left or right of the screen. What I really like about this fight in particular is how you can approach it in multiple different ways. You can use your normal sword attack on him when he is close enough, but the bow and arrow are handy in case he's too far to reach. You can use the mirror shield to deflect the feathers, but if you're about to fall off the platform, you can always use the Pegasus boots to outrun the wind. And I don't know if it's just me, but the platform feels a little bigger. The biggest problem I have with this fight is how once you stop him with your sword, you can just kind of keep spamming it until he flies up. It can make the fight a bit too short. Speaking of bosses where spamming works... What's this? Anglerfish is my second favorite boss in Link's Awakening? Yes, it's the comeback of the century. Because man, did they ever fix this battle. There were a lot of massive improvements made. For example, they added a ton of extra attacks so he doesn't just sit there, such as charging at you, having to dodge falling rubble, and summoning smaller fish. Wait a minute. What? Oh, I'm sorry. Technically, all of these attacks aren't new. I just never knew that because I killed him in 5 seconds. That was the biggest problem with this fight. You could just swim up to the boss and spam your sword until it eventually died. Luckily, the remake fixed these glaring flaws, and it takes much longer to kill the boss. From what I've seen, they gave this nightmare more health, as well as have the player bounce off the anglerfish whenever they get a hit in. It's still an easy fight, however the battle is much more enjoyable. My only suggestion would be to add a second phase to the battle. However, even without that, the improvements made here managed to create a fight that I would look forward to doing again. My favorite fight in the game definitely has to be the slime eel from Catfish's Maw. It has a good balance of difficulty while also being an enjoyable battle. Like many other Zelda bosses, it follows the use the obtained dungeon item to beat the boss formula, but it's a bit more complicated than that. The player will have to either avoid or jump over its tail while the head will occasionally pop out of the broken walls. You use the hookshot to pull it out and then whack away at its heart. But observation is key here, as it's possible to pull out a fake that happens to also be a bomb. However, the eyes on those heads are different compared to the real thing, so you have to think twice before using your hookshot. And the further you pull out the slime eel, the more time you'll have to strike it. So all at once, you are avoiding the tail, while trying to pull out the real boss and avoiding the fakes. What head comes out of the wall is, from what I know, RNG based. My first playthrough of this fight was a few minutes, while my second run of the boss was over pretty quickly. The one problem I have is more of a nitpick, but the tail movements feel a lot more random than the Game Boy game. I never bothered jumping over it because I always got hit. You could also do the ultimate cheese strat like me and just sit here in this corner until the slime eel appears. The tail will never hit you. Jokes aside, I had a fun time with this nightmare, and that's why it's my favorite boss of Link's Awakening. So what are your thoughts? Do you disagree with my list? Let me know your rankings down in the comments below. And what do you guys think about Link's Awakening? I think it's an incredible game, even though it does feel a bit overpriced. But for someone like me, it was definitely worth the experience. Stay tuned for more Link's Awakening videos, including ones similar to this. Thanks to all my patrons, you are all amazing. You can find a link to my Patreon down in the description, but never feel obligated to make a donation. I've been NintendoBlackCrisis, and I will see you all next time.